All right, so here we are at What's Up With That at 26 2nd Avenue in downtown Manhattan at East First Street. This is January 9, 2020. Can you believe it? We're in 2020. And today we're continuing with our UFO. And the subject today, and What's Up With That in the UFO series of the paranormal, is government cover-ups. That's our main topic today. And we'll talk about the history of them and a few other things. So why does the government want to cover up UFOs? I just saw a video with, Seth Shostak of the SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And, he was, acting like, why would the government cover it up? As if there aren't 100 obvious reasons why they would. But at any rate, let's get into it here. This is interesting here. I just wanted to point this out, that we have this, paper. This is the Roswell Daily Record from the day that it happened, when the government actually announced. It wasn't even some UFO cover-up people. It was the government itself, the RAAF, which I understand is the Roswell Army Air Force. They announced themselves that they captured a UFO. And a few hours later comes a different story, a completely different story. And mostly everybody bought it for whatever reason. It's amazing that, I guess the government can get away with more or less anything. And for many years, the government basically got away with it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to get into this. So this is what we hope to go over. In the first half, I'm going to go over the history of the U.S. government and UFOs. Then I'm going to go over this account that most people have never heard of, the Cape Girardeau incident in 1941, which is not far from where I grew up in Missouri, in southern Missouri. And then there's, of course, the Roswell incident. And in the second half, we're going to deal with Rendlesham Forest, the Hudson Valley Wave, the Belgian Wave, the Phoenix Lights, Area 51, and the Navy fighter plane video release of 2004. So, these are all the big headliners, It's amazing how much stuff there is out there, Each one of these things is a major deal, involving hundreds of people, some cases, But at any rate, let's start with just, how did it get like this? Why did the government decide to involve themselves in a very lengthy and protracted cover-up? How did it get there? Well, there was a time when the U.S. government had no particular policy or stand on UFOs. There was a time, in the 40s. But we see, even as we're going to talk about in a minute, even in 1941, when this Cape Girardeau incident happens, that's 6 years before Roswell, 6 years before Arnold, Kenneth Arnold. It's before UFOs became mainstream at all on any level. Still, the government grabbed everything and it disappeared. This was in 1941. So they didn't have an official policy. They didn't have an official statement by any official spokespersons for the U.S. government, but still it happened. We'll talk about that in a minute. But of course, we've talked about this a little bit, but at one point, there were enough things going on in the sky. 1947 was a bumper crop for UFOs. They were just coming out of the woodwork everywhere. When Kenneth Arnold saw the UFOs over Mount Rainier, it hit the papers, and that's where we get the word flying saucer, because he described them like saucers skipping over some water. Of course, the way he drew them, they didn't look like saucers at all. They looked like some kind of kung fu crescents or something like that. But at any rate, shortly after that, the U.S. government appointed a military group to look into it, Project Sign. And this was Ruppelt, Edward Ruppelt, who looked into Project Sign, which then became Project Grudge. And what happened in between that was, as it was closed out as Project Sign and restarted as Project Grudge, the idea was already set that these things weren't real, and that our business is not to decide whether they exist or not, or whether they're a threat or not. Our business is to somehow or other explain them all away. So already, that's why it got the name Project Grudge. So it's already heading in that direction. And then Blue Book goes into it much deeper. But it's surprising, even if you look at these accounts, Project Blue Book, or later the Robertson Report, if you read those, you'll see many accounts there that really are eye-catching. Nevertheless, the conclusion is that all these things are bogus or, misunderstood phenomenon, and we can't take them seriously. At least the people who are putting out the reports say that. There was one French reporter, a French ufologist, who read the Robertson Report. And although the Robertson Report appears to lay the entire thing to rest, saying that, these UFOs, they don't exist, but what they are is a threat to national security as a concept, not because they really exist, but because people think they exist. That's the threat. That's what Robertson and his group summed up their report. But the French ufologist read so many accounts in there, he became convinced that they really do exist. So it's interesting how this thing cuts both ways, that if you read the Robertson Report, which most people don't, you discover a lot of very credible information in there, even though Robertson himself poo-poos the whole thing. And what's interesting, at the end of the Robertson Report, we get the idea that, and the Condon Report, these are coming out about the same time, we get the idea that what UFOs are is a kind of mass hysteria. And what threat they pose is not that they're actual craft flying around, but the threat they pose is that people will rise up and get hysterical. They're worried about this. But that's not the only thing. The thing that they also are worried about is that people keep reporting these things to the military, and it takes up the military's time and their radar and their interest. So if a real, Russian missile came over aimed at New York City or something like that, then the military would be caught up with this other bogus stuff. So we should put this completely aside. And, they put forward these basic ideas that what we really need to do is to stop thinking about it. And they, after looking at all these reports, they say science will not be advanced by research into the UFOs, that we will gain no new information, so we should just stop studying this stuff. There's no credible threat, even though it's obvious. They say this over and over again, that there's no credible threat to the military or the security of the United States. Nevertheless, whenever any UFO appears in the sky, these fighter jets immediately scramble, as if they're scrambling, I guess, just for testing or whatever, We know why they're scrambling. They also are worried about what this is going on, but they don't want to let anybody know. So we went through this decades and decades of denial, and during all this kind of denial of anything that had to do with UFOs, by the military and by the government. It wasn't just the military. The government also basically more or less poo-pooed the whole idea. We have Area 51, which is the kind of epicenter of supposedly government investigation of crashed UFO aircraft. So this we'll talk about a little bit later. Of course, the Area 51 thing was denied as even existing for many years. Now, evidently, the U.S. government agrees that it does exist. I mean, you can take a picture of a sign saying Area 51, keep out. So obviously it exists. What are they doing there? Well, the government claims they're testing highly secret, secure aircraft that they're developing. So that's why they want people out of there. So that's the government's explanation of it. And, what's really going on in the whole picture of U.S. government cover-ups? At one level, it's that they don't want people so-called to panic because of hearing these UFO accounts. That's their cover story. But beyond that, we see that what they really don't want to admit, and Nick Pope says this too, that they don't want to admit there's things flying around the sky and they can't do anything about it. What government wants to say that there are things flying around in our skies and we don't have anything that we can do about it? We can't catch them, we can't stop them, we don't know who they are or whatever. They don't want to say that. However, we'll see one exception later on as we talk about this. The Belgian government did say that. They said almost exactly that. So at any rate, aside from these mysterious things flying around in the, skies over all the countries of the world, what's really going on? The government can't stop them. However, it's been going on now for decades and decades. If they had some superior military thing, it seems like we'd be already taken over. Perhaps we already are taken over. That's another possible level of this whole thing. And at a deeper level, there's obviously the possibility that the government has traded some kind of intel or some kind of engineering with these beings for the freedom for them to flip around all over our country, and the way the government deals with it is pretending they don't exist, at least on the surface. So did the government do a deal with the UFOs? Some people say yes. If they did, it's no different than 5,000 years ago when a very similar thing was going on. So back then also, the governments were compromised by very powerful beings that really could just tell them what to do. In some cases, were the government. So that's a possibility. Are we already under the control of some extraterrestrial group? Well, that's a possibility too, to some extent or another. Of course, the government's layers and layers of things, and one layer doesn't know what the other's doing, and there's probably all kinds of factions. So all that's there. We'll probably never know how the whole deal works. But at any rate, we can kind of see that the government's compromised in some way or another. And the reason that this isn't going to come out simply or going to come out tomorrow is because there's layers of cover-up of people who have been murdered, of people who have, wound up saying something they shouldn't have said, of technologies that the government doesn't want to acknowledge exist, and things the government did that are totally, completely unethical. So this is the reason why, they may let some levels of the veil open, but other levels will not. It's like an onion. It just goes down and down and down and down. But there's no need to necessarily get to the whole bottom and know all the gritty details, because essentially we know the reasons why they fear a disclosure in general, and why they don't really want to get down to it is because they don't want the people who did the stuff that they weren't supposed to do to get lynched. They don't want to, lose all faith by people in the government. They don't want to admit that they made a deal with the devil if they did, and all this kind of things. And they don't want to admit that they have technologies that make what we're actually doing today mostly useless. They don't want to unleash them on the world. Now, some of these things aren't exactly completely wrong fears, but at any rate, the government's a onion, layers and layers of things. Some of them good, some of them bad. Some parts of it are genuine, some parts of it are rotten. And so these are all the reasons why it's such a mixed up, messed up thing. And of course, this has been going on now for decades and decades, since even the 40s. We said that it started then. Here we are in 2020. So that's 80 years, something like that, or more. And now the most recent thing was this ATIP story, which is, Advanced Aeronautics Threat Investigation Program or something like that, Threat Assessment or Investigation or something program. And this was the story that they released about the flying Tic Tacs that buzzed the USS Nimitz off the coast of California. So that's an interesting thing. We just get little snippets of the aircraft and their radar sightings. That's what we see on television. But it's a whole larger story that you had this whole Navy operation taking place with planes in the air, with aircraft carriers and destroyers and all this other stuff. And these aircraft, we're going to talk about this too, these aircraft begin seeing these things that they describe like Tic Tacs. They're these little white things about 40 foot long. They're not so little, but no wings, nothing, just like a capsule like you take for your cold or something like that, but they're all white. They're spherical on the ends and cylindrical in the middle. They've got little antenna coming out of it, and they fly around these most advanced Navy jets like they're standing still. So at any rate, we'll talk about this. And of course, the big name here is Dr. Stephen Greer, who has got his disclosure project, and he claims on his website that he's got 800 whistleblowers that are testifying. And they're people out of the Navy, out of the Air Force, out of various government offices, and various private military sectors who have done business with the government. And journalists and people like that, people who were told to shut up, people who work for the government, people who don't want to buy it anymore, people who want to see the lid lifted off the whole thing. So at any rate, we'll see how that evolves. So this is kind of a history. We go from the government having no official policy to gradually coming up with the poo-poo, no, this doesn't exist, little green men, ha-ha, laugh it off, to no one can talk about this. Anyone in the military is forbidden to talk about this outside. They sign even, if you go to Area 51 and you work there, you have to sign these agreements that you're never going to speak about anything that you do there or any of that, or else it'll be very bad for you. So at any rate, this is our sort of brief thumbnail history of government and UFOs and their connection with them. This is one of the most interesting that I run onto, which was way back in 1914, that there was a Reverend William Huffman who received a phone call one day that there'd been a crash outside of Cape Girardeau in the, I think, northwest of Cape Girardeau. And so he went there, and when he arrived there, he noticed there was a huge amount of personnel there. It wasn't just, he assumed it was a light plane or something that crashed, but there were fire trucks and ambulances and all kinds of, the military were there and everything. And he was led to where the crash was. And it wasn't any kind of aircraft he ever had seen in his life. It was some kind of round kind of an aircraft. And he immediately saw some dead bodies, but the bodies weren't like human. They were small. They were like 3 or 4 feet tall. And 2 of the apparently FBI men, there is a picture of this, but whether this is actually the real picture of it, I don't know. The real picture of this event disappeared. However, it's evidently there were photographers there taking lots of pictures, but none of those pictures have ever surfaced anywhere. So they held up this almost dead extraterrestrial, and asked this minister, William Huffman, Reverend William Huffman, to perform last rites for him because he was obviously dying, and he did die right after that. And the military and the people there forbade the Reverend or any of the other people who were there to talk about this at all to anybody, that this was national security and they couldn't. This was the beginning of this concept, and he did clam up and not speak to anyone. However, he did tell his wife, and his wife eventually told one of her daughters, and this daughter, Charlotte Mann, gave the testimony of this at some point later on. And there's corroborating papers and document trails that go with this. There's a fire department report that there was a crash on that day near Cape Girardeau. And this is one of those stories that's hard to get much more out of, but very interesting. This is the first time that we hear that beings are found at a crash site, and what happens to them, what happens to their bodies. There was, autopsies done on them, and one account goes that some nurse who was part of the autopsy on her deathbed came forward with the idea that she had been part of this autopsy and described the being and how bad it smelled and how it wasn't anything like anything she's ever done before and all this kind of thing. So this is 1941. One of the things that Sadaputa or Richard Thompson Point makes in this Alien Identities book is the idea that this is what makes the whole UFO thing so difficult. Because if you are in the military, or even if you're in journalism and you're reporting these things, and you come from our usual Western mindset of science and things working in a very predictable way, and that all of our scientists are right and they know mostly everything. If you come from that background, first you find out that there are these things flying around the sky that do things that nobody can explain. Take right-angle turns, fly at 4,000 miles an hour, and suddenly stop. And, this doesn't make any sense. So it's bad enough that this is happening. Then when you investigate a little further, you discover there are little people inside them, which is a whole other ball of wax. If you had trouble believing or dealing with the first, now you're into level 2. Now you have to deal with the fact that there are people in them, and they are not people as we know them. They're small, 3 or 4 feet tall, grayish, and they appear to have very big eyes and very small lips and noses that are very small, ears that practically don't exist. Then on top of that, the next thing, you hear that those people are doing things that don't make any sense either, that they can levitate, or they can shine, or they can read minds, or, so you can see why this whole thing, for most people who are raised in this Western outlook, our modern mythology of the 21st century, that science is everything, science is the bottom of everything. We know at least 80% of everything that's possible to know. I mean, this is the kind of way people think. And all this, it just slaps you in the face back and forth again and again. First, there's things doing stuff in the air. One of the airmen on this Nimitz, encounter made the quip, that he said, I don't know what these things are, but I sure as hell want to fly one. So he was, amazed by what they were doing, and he wanted to get behind the wheel of one of those and see what it'd be like to fly it. Anyway, the big one is Roswell. Who can ever get away from Roswell? Is kind of the watershed of the whole UFO encounter. And we we started off by showing Marcel and his kind of photo op with this weather balloon. So, as we said, in 1947, this William Brazel, who was a employee for this ranch, I forget what the owner of the ranch's name was, but he was an employee. He went rumbling through what appeared to be some wreckage, and he began to see some strange things. So he called the sheriff, and the sheriff is named Wilcox, Sheriff Wilcox. Sheriff Wilcox and them both scratched their heads, and they thought, well, the military should help us out on this. So they get in contact with Jesse Marcel, Major Jesse Marcel, who comes out there. And that's when Jesse Marcel went to the, and the people, I think someone over him, went and made the press release that, you know, we have been hearing about these things flying around in the sky. What are they? But now we actually have one. The government has got one, so we're going to be able to look at it, and we'll tell you what they are. So this was the nature of that news release that came out. I don't know how wide it was. Evidently, it wasn't so widely there wasn't, I think, a big thing like we have these times, a big API and all this, where something just goes out worldwide or instantaneously. So, at any rate, the paper went out, and then literally hours later, the whole story changes. The whole story completely changes. It comes back that actually it was a weather balloon. They were mistaken. This is, of course, the big investigative interest of Friedman Stanton. Some of you may have heard of him. That he's a nuclear physicist who turned into investigating UFOs. And he was the one that said, wait a minute, this Roswell thing there's more to it than what the government's telling us. And the more he read into it, the more he looked at the document, the more he interviewed people, he began to believe that the government was just trying to push this off the table, make it completely, into nothing when it was seriously something. And, of course, now many of the people who were back then have stepped forward, at least if they're still alive, or maybe a few years ago they've stepped forward and described that actually there was some kind of alien craft, and that there was some foil that was as thin as tinfoil, but you couldn't dent it with a sledgehammer, and that there were these beams inside the craft that looked like I-beams, but they had various hieroglyphics on them that were raised, and they weren't any language from the earth that we know of. So these kind of things came out from not only some of these people, but also some of their children. Evidently Brazel had a son who learned something, and Jesse Marcel, I think, had a son also who became a doctor and also explained what he had seen himself as a child, So all this stuff is there. And we can see that from investigating particularly Roswell, this is a second episode of the military finding what appear to be bodies of non-humans in the craft. And where do those bodies go? What happens to them? So that's the next item there. So, of course, Roswell is the watershed, or the thing that really blew it out. And what's impressive about it is that when it happened in 1947, the government was successful in actually more or less pushing the whole thing under the rug. They were successful with their, their explanations and their poo-pooing and saying it's a weather balloon and this and that and the other. These completely unbelievable kind of cover-ups that they're putting out about it. But later on, this whole thing comes to undo itself. And now it's certainly not so clear, really not at all clear that this is what the the whole story was. I'm going to break here for a minute so I can start segment 2, because I'm trying to keep these in my 30-minute segments. So I'm going to